without further ado, Andrew, if you want to begin.
Hello, I'm a journalist blogger, and I feel a slight fraud at an academic blogging conference because journalism and academia are really rather different, but they're not entirely different because we're both kind of professions or trade where up until about 10 years ago the way we communicated hadn't changed for 300 years or more. For me, I still think of myself as a newspaper journalist. For those of you who are academics, you wrote books and you lectured, and that's the way it had always been. And then along comes the internet and suddenly disrupts enormously this pattern of working life that we've been used to. And for journalists, the internet has been an enormous opportunity. There are journalists that are communicating more than ever before to a wider audience, more frequently. I now write a daily politics live blog which aims to cover pretty much everything that's happening in Westminster on that day. And I find it immensely more satisfying than newspaper journalism, because my memories of newspaper journalism were you were operating in this story-rich environment, and yet unless you could actually boil down what you had learned into a news story that was attractive to your news editors, then you had no chance of publishing it. And then even then, you would write it, and half the time it would get cut to pieces, or it wouldn't make space, or something else would come along, and your story would get bounced out. So you'd end up going home thinking, I've kind of accumulated a batch of knowledge, and I've only really been able to pass about 20% of it on. In an era of the web, that's no longer a problem. But it's also been kind of immensely disruptive to journalists, in that we used to think of ourselves as a great authority profession. We were the ones who knew what we were talking about. We would cast our verdict on the day's events, and it would go out sort of in print, and apart from the odd letter back from the readers, or perhaps an angry phone call from a politician, you never really got much. You were never challenged or contested by your readership. And now, in the era of blogging, we have comment sections at the bottom of all our stories and blogs, and these readers have the temerity to come back and tell you you're wrong, or you've got something, or they know more about it than you, or even worse, they set up blogs themselves and start writing about subjects that we thought was the province of professional journalism. And that, I guess, is an experience you are facing too. So it's been kind of disruptive. It's kind of raised long-term questions about the future of certainly my profession. I mean, is there going to be a need for paid professional journalists in an era when everyone can be a journalist? And it's also meant that we're doing far more work than we ever did before, which again I think is probably something we have in common with those academics here who are asked to blog. As to how to do it effectively, I don't claim to know all the answers, but as someone who pretty much does nothing else but blog, and has done for the last kind of 5 years, and also I think of myself as a kind of avid consumer, or sort of would-be consumer of academic blogging, because I'm constantly looking for. I'm conscious that there are university departments stuffed full of people who study subjects I write about in far more depth than I ever do. And as a consumer, I'd very much like to harvest that knowledge. And yet, my experience of academic blogging has been distinctly mixed. I've found some fantastic examples and some less fantastic ones. My first point about how to do it effectively would be you've got to want to do it. You've got to kind of have the desire to communicate. And often when I read academic blogs, I get the impression that someone has been chivied into writing something by the head of their department, or the sort of the university sort of PR person, and their heart wasn't in it. And frankly, and I think this applies to not just to blogging, but to book writing and pretty much any form of communication. If you don't want to say anything, then frankly go off and do something else, because save yourself a lot of time. And that brings me on to kind of why should academics blog, which is, and the answer is quite straightforward. Blog if you have something to communicate. Journalists are people who kind of want to find out what's happening and share it with readers, with the world. Academia is not the same, but you're all people who want to communicate what you have discovered about the world to your own audience. And it doesn't, some of that overlaps with what we do, and I think that the borders between journalism and academia are going to probably break down a bit further. Some of it doesn't necessarily, and there is you don't have to communicate effectively. You don't have to communicate to a mass audience, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with passionately sharing your views or your findings with a kind of small group of other people who are equally passionate about your subject. There's an anecdotal story about Peter Jay, the kind of economist and broadcaster who early in his career was a economics leader writer on the Times, who at some stage in the 60s or whatever it was wrote a particularly impenetrable leader, and a sub came and complained to him that he couldn't understand it, and Peter Jay apparently said sort of majestically, well, this is only meant to be read by three people: the Permanent Secretary at the Treasury, the Chancellor and the Governor of the Bank of England, and you're not one of them. And that, it strikes me that as a formula for sort of journalism, even Times journalism in the 1960s, is a quite a bad formula. But as an approach to blogging, it's fine. If only three people are reading your blog, but there are three people who matter, then that's great. You're performing a valid function. My next point would be about having something new to say, and this comes back to my disappointment with some of the sort of politics blogging that I read, in that I'll read an academic who's decided to address a subject like Scottish independence or the politics of climate change, or prospects of the Conservative winning the next election, and feel the need to take an overview, and I'll kind of read 400, 500 words, and it's all perfectly fine, perfectly valid, and I agree with every word of it, but it doesn't really tell me anything that I hadn't read anywhere else, which is, it's a drawback in conventional newspaper journalism, but in an era where if someone has written a perfectly good explanation of the politics of Scottish independence, and you can find it on the web, it's a real kind of crime to expect someone else to read another version, and it's even more a crime to waste your own time writing something that's available elsewhere. So I would much rather read blogs written by some people who know when they have got something kind of new to say on the subject, don't feel the need to give me the kind of comprehensive overview and tell me things that I already know, but just kind of focus very much on the one bit of the story or the picture that's where they've got something fresh to say. And that, I suppose, takes me on to another point, which is, I think it's very important for people in the blogosphere to specialise, to become the expert voice on a particular subject. And the academic blogger who is most valued, I think, by the journalists I work with is Philip Cowley, who has cornered the market in kind of parliamentary rebellions, and it helps that he's got a nice turn of phrase and he can kind of write like a journalist, and it helps that the data that he produces on parliamentary voting is of use to us, because frankly no one else is producing it, and most of the Westminster journalists that I work with haven't got time to sort of work out kind of what percentage of how the number of government defeats in this parliament compares to the number in the kind of 45, 50 parliaments, and do it on a party-by-party basis. But he produces kind of raw data that no one else is producing that is of use to us, and he's cornered the market in it. which is great, but there are plenty of other markets out there where there aren't distinctive sort of academic specialist voices, or rather there probably are, but they're kind of lurking away somewhere in some academic department, and kind of no one has discovered them yet and put them out there. My next point is slightly harder to summarise. I've got it down here as being provisional, by which I mean my sense is that a lot of academics come to blogging as if they are kind of writing a book, and they feel that actually unless every assertion is nailed down, every adjective is justified, every aspect of the thing is covered, then somehow their colleagues in the common room are going to look down on them, or they'll be sort of, you know, letting their standards down. Yet blogging isn't book publishing. Blogging is more conversational. Blogging, the best kind of single text on blogging is written by Andrew Sullivan, the British writer who kind of now blogs from America, who's one of the sort of pioneering bloggers about sort of 7-8 years ago. Wrote an essay, kind of Why I Blog, which is still the best sort of single thing on the subject, and I'd recommend it strongly. And one of the points that he makes is that he views blogging as broadcasting. It's your kind of filling space, it's got to be immediate, you're not trying to come up with a final word, you're bouncing off what your readers suggest you. It's provisional, it's conversational, it's temporary, it's unfinished. And certainly journalistically, we found that readers accept that, and particularly if you approach it from the point of view of saying, here's what I know, here's what I don't know, help me out with the rest of it. No one's going to complain that you're supposed to be the great authority and you don't know. They understand that something you knock off in half an hour on a Thursday morning when you haven't got the full facts is not going to be the final word. I sense that kind of academics are kind of too worried about that. I kind of think they shouldn't be if they want to embrace the virtues of blogging. Which brings me to another point, which is speed. If you, some of you, probably aren't interested in blogging to a journalistic type audience, by which I mean either a mass audience like the audience we have, or you want your stuff to get picked up by journalists. But if you do want your stuff to get picked up by journalists or the kind of people who consume journalism, then you've got to write your post when they're interested. I quite often get kind of approached by people sort of flagging up journalistic blogs, the day after I was, yesterday I was writing about more or less nothing else but Scottish independence and oil. Today I'm writing about something else. Sort of, it wouldn't surprise me though to get an email this afternoon from some academic saying I've just posted this lovely blog on sort of Scotland and oil, and that's great, but sort of, journalists are horrifically kind of short, or rather they suffer from horrifically short attention spans and they're no longer interested. So if you kind of want the stuff to get picked up, to make things worse, the new journalistic news cycles are getting shorter and shorter. Kind of 24 hours is no longer really the news cycle, and it's kind of moved on within 12 hours, or from kind of breakfast to lunchtime our attention has started to shift. So if you want to kind of grab our attention, you've got to be really, really quick. It's also important to have a voice. Blogging, the best blogs have a voice. They're kind of personal. That doesn't mean you have to describe what you ate for breakfast or what you're doing at the weekend or kind of where you're going on your holidays. But it's a format where you can be more subjective than if you're writing a sort of book-length treatise. And so, as a kind of newspaper journalist who'd spent kind of almost 20 years writing in the third person and avoiding anything subjective, I found the leap to doing kind of sort of more personal blogging slightly difficult, but actually once you've embraced it, sort of it's fine. and certainly you engage much more with readers if they think there's a real person on the other end of the screen. And my final point would be embrace Twitter. Increasingly, I've come to see sort of Twitter as quite big competition for the kind of blogging that I do, because certainly when I was doing a live election blog 4 years ago, lots of people were saying to me they liked it because it was a roundup of everything that's happening that day. Now those people are getting all of that from Twitter. So I think you have to be out there on Twitter too, which again is particularly difficult if you're if you're uncomfortable with summarising things in 500 words rather than a book length, then doing it in kind of 140 characters is going to really scare some people too. But try it, and you'll find you can say intelligent and sensible things in that format without anyone kind of thinking you're sort of banal or stupid. That's it, I think, on my sort of thumbnail guide to how to blog effectively, but I'd like to come back to any questions.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Andrew. I think we'll just move swiftly over now to Chris.